Welcome to the study on this autumn morning. Please make yourself comfortable. I'm so glad you're here today. You see what I've got for you. A few books. I've been picking them out from the shelves. I thought you might like to take a look today into the timeless and extensive legend of King Arthur. It all starts in the late Roman Empire. An empire that was overextended and being encroached upon from all sides by groups and peoples hostile to Roman rule or wishing to extend their own territories. In its later years, Rome was an empire divided. Largely, this is remembered as the Eastern Empire becoming Byzantium, that flourished for hundreds of years later after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. But it was, as you can see, much more complex than that. As we look at this empire in roughly 4 parts, we can understand how vast its reaches were, how many different peoples and cultures it encompassed, to whom the Roman stories, literature, thought, innovations, industry, and administration was all commonplace and part of their everyday lives to some extent or another. Far to the northwest of the empire in the province of Britannia, there was a general called Maximus, or Maximus. He had served in Britain and Gaul and became emperor of the Western Roman Empire, if self-proclaimed, from 383 to 388. Having usurped the throne from Chrétien, he was then defeated by Theodosius and executed, marking a turning point for imperial presence in the Western Empire. Maximus, having been credited in some texts establishing bases and settlements from Britannia in Brittany and Galicia. All along this Atlantic area, bringing his Britons south. Maximus passed into history and is a prominent figure in Welsh legends, where he is the father of the Briton kings Ambrosius and Uther, and grandfather to Arthur. As King of the Britons is largely a myth. There is scant evidence that is historical about him, but there are bits. He has been the subject of stories for more than 1,000 years. Most of the time representing a just fight for a lost cause or dream, possibly that of the falling Roman administration and centralized defenses for Britain under threat from Picts and Saxons. Possibly the loss of that cultural history and ideal that was engendered among the populations of its furthest reaches, perhaps for ideals that later came to be synonymous with chivalry, justice, charity, and courtliness, knightly behavior. He is also in stories about the search for the Holy Grail, the Holy Grail itself becoming a prolific term used to symbolize something for which one is always searching, something elusive. Today, my friend, I have brought together for you my favorite, most relaxing study videos having to do with Arthurian legend and myth. And featuring Arthurian material from diverse playlists covering language, texts, tours, history, myth and legend into this extra long compilation for you to imagine and dream. As we enjoy Arthur in the study today. from England. We'll listen to some history and look at some maps. We'll talk about sources and literature and chronicles such as the Historia Britonum and Gildas de Excidio. Naturally, we'll read some Latin and translate a bit. So sit back, enjoy the sounds as we travel back to 5th century England. Badon Hill is the legendary battle fought around 500 AD between Britons and Saxons in post-Roman Britain. It was said to have been a major victory for the Britons, by some accounts under the command of Arthurian, a warlord, putting a halt to the century-long attacks on Britannia from across the North Sea and the encroachment of new Anglo-Saxon kingdoms for a brief and relatively peaceful period. The earliest references to this battle are by the 6th century British cleric Gildas, popular today as containing the first mention of King Arthur, beginning a tradition that caught the imagination of later audiences, appearing in the 9th century Historia Britonum, attributed to a certain Nennius, in which Arthur serves as a war commander of Britain. However, as these sources are not explicit or detailed, a date, location, or even details of the battle itself, such as who led and participated, remain conjecture. Here we can see southern England from Londinium to Ventasilurum and everything important in between. Aquae Sulis, Corinium, Caleva, Venta. These were the areas where much of the Saxon fighting was taking place, and along these routes you can see the Roman roads and lindens. There were numerous hill forts. Many of these hill forts have their own local histories, claiming to be the site of the Battle of Badon Hill. We're going to look at two of the texts in Latin and translate one of them. But first, some background. Roman Britain was a prosperous and comfortable province in some cases their own local and, as it were, devolved governance, enjoyed a fairly high standard of living, with running water, sewage, public spaces, centralized coinage, direct roads, and organized standing military defenses, as well as a bustling trade in agricultural products as well as minerals, such as tin, in exchange for luxuries from the south and east. At the edge of the most powerful empire the Western world had ever seen, Britain was no less a part of a far-reaching network of commerce and culture. Peter Frankopan, writing the economic history of Europe, writes that, for the vast majority of the population in antiquity, horizons were decidedly local, with trade and interaction between people being carried out over short distances. Nevertheless, the webs of communities wove into each other to create a world that was complex, where tastes and ideas were shaped by products, artistic principles, and influences thousands of miles apart. 2 millennia ago, silks made by hand in China were being worn by the rich and powerful in Carthage and other cities in the Mediterranean, while pottery manufactured in southern France could be found in England and in the Persian Gulf. Spices and condiments grown in India were being used in the kitchens of Xinjiang as they were in those of Rome. Buildings in northern Afghanistan carried inscriptions in Greek, while horses from Central Asia were being ridden proudly thousands of miles away to the east. We can imagine the life of a gold coin 2 millennia ago, struck perhaps in a provincial mint, and used by a young soldier as part of his pay to buy goods on the northern frontier in England, and finding its way back to Rome in the coffers of an imperial official sent to collect taxes before passing into the hands of a trader heading east, and then being used to pay for produce bought from traders who had come to sell their provisions at Barigaza. There it was admired and presented to the leaders in the Hindu Kush, who marveled at its design, shape, and size, and then gave it over to be copied by an engraver, himself perhaps from Rome, perhaps from Persia, or even from India or China, or perhaps even someone local who had been taught the skills of striking. This was a world that was connected, complex, and hungry for exchange. It is easy to mold the past into a shape that we find convenient and accessible, but the ancient world was much more sophisticated and interlinked than we sometimes like to think. The later centuries were not without trouble, however, as the overextended empire contended with division and rebellion, incursions of barbarian tribes along every border, the Picts in the north, as well as economic challenges. Britain played no small part in this, having been the seat to several of the western usurpers cum emperors. In 410, things were looking grim for the wealthy landowners, city and village dwellers alike, when Honorius recalled the remains of the Roman military from the province, with the advice that they should look to their own defenses. Frankopan remarks, "These days it is voguish to talk of an age of transformation and continuities that followed the sack of Rome, rather than to describe the period as the Dark Ages. And yet, as one modern scholar argues powerfully, the impact of the rape, pillage, and anarchy that marked the 5th century as the Goths, Alans, Vandals, and Huns rampaged across Europe and North Africa is hard to exaggerate. Literacy levels plummeted, building in stone all but disappeared, a clear sign of collapse of wealth and ambition. Long-distance trade that once took pottery from factories in Tunisia as far as Ionia in Scotland collapsed, replaced by local markets dealing only with exchange of petty goods, and as measured from pollution in polar ice caps in Greenland. There was a major contraction in smelting work, with levels falling back to those of prehistoric times. Contemporaries struggled to make sense of what, to them, was the complete collapse of the world order. Although Britain was not a Mediterranean province, rich in eastern trade potential, as well as political sophistication, it nonetheless presents us with a valuable and unique picture of human history at the far reaches of an empire that absorbed into it every people and culture that it so easily conquered, giving to them a Roman identity, whilst not completely destroying their own heritage. Unlike other parts of the empire, we have precious little in the way of historical sources from this period of Britain's history, such as scanty archaeological evidence, which is constantly being discovered, and little to nothing in writing. We can piece together from continental sources and archaeology what was likely to have occurred politically, militarily, and economically. But the really interesting factor is what these British peoples thought about this light that would soon be extinguished, a life they had known with ideals, literature, infrastructure, and culture that was about to be snuffed out like a candle flame, with nothing to illuminate the dark times ahead. What stories did they tell? How had they been educated? How did they view their own history? And how closely did their lives and culture identify with their concept of Rome? Did they consider themselves the truer part of the empire by that time? We know that in the years following the military and administrative withdrawal from Britannia, an equally legendary story survives of the Briton prince Vortigern, his marriage to the barbarian princess Rowena, his invitation to the Saxons to come to Britain to help defend against the incursions of the Picts to the north and west, and of Hengist and Horsa's betrayal, and Vortigern's role in it, setting the stage for the imminent need to decisively rid the island of invaders. After 410 AD, no written account gives direct evidence of the events in the British Isles. Gildas Sapiens, or Gildas the Wise, a British monk writing in the early 6th century, offers us the first insight into a world that had lost many of its points of reference. De excidio et conquestu Britanniae, of the destruction and conquest of Britain. Cut off from the continent, insular scholars retained their knowledge of the Latin language, as well as the writings of the fathers of the Christian Church. We cannot do more than guess at the immediate sequel to the letters sent by Honorius in 410. That council will have been divided is certain, since there was no central authority by whom a single policy could be imposed. There will have been some who continued to believe that help would yet come from Rome, from Roman forces in Gaul, there will have been others to argue that the wisest plan was to follow the policy that had been pursued with good effect in different parts of the empire, the policy of setting a thief to catch a thief. They would say the right course was to bring some of the barbarians into Britain and give them land on which to settle in return for their services as fighting men. Many of the wealthy, not knowing whither they were going, would seek their own personal safety in flight beyond the sea, taking their valuables with them, or burying them in the ground against the hope of eventual return. The book written by Gildas is the principal embodiment of a strong tradition that the fall of Britain had been brought about by the policy, catastrophic in its outcome for British, of inviting Germanic mercenaries to settle within the country in the hope that they might restore the island the security which it enjoyed for centuries through the protection of the Roman army. The history of the Britons, Historia Britonum, presents a supposed history of the indigenous Brittonic people, written in the 9th century and surviving in numerous manuscripts dating from the 10th century onward, commonly attributed to a certain Nennius, as some versions have a preface written in his name. It has been dubbed a possible anonymous compilation of other histories or chronicles. This text differs widely from manuscript to manuscript, and it is impossible to derive an authentic version, the later reproductions influenced by and intermingling invariably with Geoffrey of Monmouth's fantastical Historia. The manuscript of the Historia Britonum most often referenced is the manuscript Harleian 3859H in the British Library, late 11th century, the only manuscript that contains the Historia Britonum in its fullest form, though with no prologue, and one of only 2 manuscripts that contain chapters 57 to 66. The Harleian 3859 also contains by far the oldest versions of the Annales Cambriae and the Welsh dynastic genealogies. These Annales Cambriae, or Latin for Annals of Wales, are 10th century chronicles compiled and derived from diverse sources at St. David's in Wales, of which only a 12th century copy is extant. It records events in Wales, Ireland, Cornwall, England, and Scotland, penning what would become the matter of Britain, Arthurian legend with its own genre in the High Middle Ages, taken up by such famed poets as Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach. Let's now read about Badon Hill in Gildas de Excidio, the siege of Mons Badonicus, chapter 26. From that time, the citizens were sometimes victorious, sometimes the enemy. This continued up to the year of the siege of Badon Hill, and of almost the last great slaughter inflicted upon the rascally crew. And this commences a fact I know, as the 44th year, with 1 month now elapsed. It is also the year of my birth. But not even at the present day are the cities of our country inhabited as formerly. Deserted and dismantled, they lie neglected until now, because, although wars with foreigners have ceased, domestic wars continue. The recollection of so hopeless a ruin of the island, and of the unlooked-for help, has been fixed in the memory of those who have survived as witnesses of both marvels, as they died away when an age had succeeded ignorant of that storm, and having experience only of the present quiet, all the controlling influences of truth and justice were so shaken and overturned that, not to speak of traces, not even the remembrance of them is to be found among the ranks named above. I make exception of a few, a very few, who, owing to the loss of the vast multitude that rushes daily to hell, are counted at so small a number. Let's have a look at the Historia Britonum. This one is a very pretty copy with some Celtic or even Art Nouveau style designs on it, but the English translation is from the 19th century, and I think we can do better. So let's look at the Latin. Here in Part 4, Chapter 56, it tells of a leader called Arthur, and lists all of his successful battles against the Saxons, and Hengist and Octa, Cantorum, Glen, Tuplas, Cat Coit Calidon, Coinon, and the 12th battle, Duodecimum fuit bellum in Monte Badonis, tells of the battle at Badon Hill. Let's translate that. Mount Badon, the 12th battle. For it followed, or was, because they're listing battles, on Mount Badon, in quo corruerunt, so in which, that's our relative, referring back to bellum. Corruerunt is our verb. We will leave as they fell in uno die, in one day. Again, our ablative of time within which. Non agenti 900 sexaginta 960 weary fell. Weary men. And that is our subject, weary corruerunt. De uno, from one, impetu Arthur, and they've got Arthur in the nominative here for some reason. Would put him in the genitive. One charge. So this battle, this 12th battle on Badon Hill, in which fell in one day 960 men from one charge by Arthur, and Nemo, no one. Prostravit eos, nisi ipse solus, ipse referring back to Arthur himself, alone. So no one, Nemo is our subject. Prostravit, and here we get our prostrate, from prostrate, to strike down. No one struck them down. Nisi, except Arthur himself alone. That's a very interesting verb to use here. We're getting quite a lot of imagery, striking down the Saxons. And I will be nice and poetic, but Arthur himself. How shall we put solus into English? Arthur himself, I think, pretty much gives us the meaning we need. Et in omnibus, and in omnibus bellis, everyone or all of, we have a genitive, wars, all of the wars. Extitit, he emerged. And our appositive as victor. And there is our Latin from Historia Britonum. This is a very interesting text, as we have seen that the beginning relates the original settlers of Britain to Aeneas and those who fled from Troy. So not only do we have here an author and an audience itself, but also the impetus and motivation to connect these inhabitants of Britain with those who founded Rome and its great empire and culture itself. So you can see how little we have about this battle itself, upon which so much imagination and legend and stories were woven to create this huge corpus of Arthurian literature and ideals and dreams throughout history. Welcome, my friend, to this special library and archive, where we have some secrets to discover. So, you are looking for something. May I see what you have? Look at that. It's a map of Europe. L'Europe and states, empires, kingdoms and republics. We have Spain, Portugal, France, the Italian states, Austria-Hungary, Greece, Germany, Britain, the Low Countries, Denmark, Scandinavia, and Russia. The Ottoman Empire. What did you say? You're looking for something along a line. Not exactly a ley line. Right you are. Well, according to most of our studies, ley lines don't exist as such. At any rate, the explanation given has been shown to be quite contrived or too much inferred from the information that we have. But you've got some coordinates and a compass heading. So what you sent me earlier, I've pinpointed here to these islands in the Adriatic. They're very low islets just on the other side of the Gulf of Venice or the Adriatic Sea. And your heading is 286. Well, let's get our plotter, and we should be able to do this quite well. Now, as you can see, the longitude lines are curved. It's not a Mercator projection. So we've got to curve our north, so we'll have to, because we're covering such a large area, we'll have to guess about the north. And we'll put north about there. And let's set this one at 286 degrees. There is our point down here. And we've got just about pointing north there is this little spot in Brittany where you've given me the distance. This, I take it, is the mysterious and magical location about which you would like more information. As you can see, Brittany is a peninsula that is on France's northwest coast, jutting out into the Atlantic at the end of the English Channel. This little peninsula has the Channel Islands on its western side. This is the Cotentin that we can see there, Cotentin, and Saint-Malo, and the border of Brittany, Mont Saint-Michel, and on the south coast we have Lorient and Quiberon. And what you've given me points to the very heart of Brittany. I think I have some things, some materials that will help you. Just the thing. Now I've got this map of Brittany where we can see all of its coastline, its rivers, its forests. Shall we have a look at that? There we have all of the coast and the westernmost promontories there, the rocky islands and outcrops, the cliffs, and the rugged north coast. We have the Emerald Coast and the coast of Armorica from the Armor tribes, the Celtic tribes that were there. you're looking for a forest, I think that if we go up this river, we can see that at the very corner of this river lies a forest, and that is just outside of the small town of Rennes. That is where we need to look. And you've come to the right place, because I can tell you that this forest that you have come to in your navigational calculations is called Brocéliande. A legendary enchanted forest in Brittany, though its exact location has been something of an uncertainty. Today it is largely accepted to be the Pimpon forest just outside of Rennes. And I think we can actually see the name on this old map. This forest of Pimpon covers roughly 50 square kilometers, and Brocéliande is contained within it, a forest that might be said to exist in the space between dream and reality, in the mystical land of Celts, Druids, and Stone Age megaliths. Legend has it that this forest is home to magical, violent storms. Morgan Le Fay's Vale of No Return, the Miroir of Fay Lake, and a fairy spring, the Fountain of Badon, where the tomb of the great sorcerer Merlin lies, the living soul of Brocéliande. Each year, thousands of flowers, bracelets, and poems are placed on this mysterious tomb. The wanderer will also find the famous golden tree that drew medieval alchemists, the guillotine oak, which is over 1,000 years old, and the tree of Les Andes, 5 meters in diameter. Deep in the forest, there are giant moss-covered trees, twisted as if frozen in some inescapable, magical struggle, and the imagination is ignited. Every rock, every tree, and every lake and spring in this magical place wields a power over the imagination, and in the depths of the forest we can find Merlin's secrets. Brocéliande first appears in literature in the Roman de Roux. And this is an Anglo-Norman chronicle about the Dukes of Normandy by Robert Was, written about 1160. And here we have a piece from a 19th century edition of Wes. Let's see what he writes about Brocéliande. le roman de roue et des ducs de Normandie, pour remembrer des ancêtres, les faits et les dits et les morts, des dans les livres et les gestes, et les histoires lire à feste, les félonies des félons, et les barnages. The Duke rejoiced greatly at receiving the gonfanon and the license which the apostle gave him. He got together carpenters, smiths, and other workmen, so that great stir was seen at all the ports of Normandy, in the collecting of wood and materials, cutting of planks, framing of ships and boats, stretching sails and rearing masts, with great pains and at great cost. They spent all one summer and autumn in fitting up the fleet and collecting the forces, and there was no knight in the land, no good sergeant, usher, or peasant of stout heart, and age for battle, that the Duke did not summon to go with him to England, promising rents to the vavassors and honours to the barons. The Duke had men from many and various parts. Haman, the Viscount of Tours, came thither, a man of very great power, who could bring much people. Alain Felgin also came to the crossing, and brought with him great baronage from among the Britons, and Fitz Bertrand le Pelay, and the Sire de Dinan came also, and Raoul de Gale, and many Britons from many castles, and from about Brocéliande, concerning which the Britons tell many fables. Brocéliande being Brocéliande. It is a forest, long and broad, much famed throughout Brittany. The fountain of Berenton rises from beneath a stone there. Thither the hunters are used to repair in sultry weather, and drawing up water with their horns, they sprinkle the stone for the purpose of having rain, which is then wont to fall, they say, throughout the whole forest around. But why, I know not. There, too, fairies are to be seen, if the Bretons tell the truth, and many other wonders happen. The ground is broken and precipitous, and deer in plenty roam there. But the husbandmen have deserted it. I went thither on purpose to see these marvels. I saw the forest and the land, and I sought for the marvels, but I found none. I went like a fool, and so I came back. I sought after a folly, and hold myself a fool for my pains. So he's telling about the preparations for the Dukes of Normandy to follow William across the Channel to Angleterre or England. And here they are. You can see them building the ships that will carry them across. And Brittany itself has always been known as a place for brave and courageous knights. So if William was able to get the support of the Dukes of Brittany, he would be a very happy commander indeed. After Wass's history, this forest captured the imagination of medieval Europeans as a place of magic and mystery. Consequently, Brocéliande is mentioned in several medieval stories connected to Arthurian legend. featuring the figures of Merlin the Wizard, Morgan Le Fay, the Lady of the Lake, among some of the knights of the Round Table. It is also the forest in which Yvain begins his adventures by pouring water from a spring on a stone. That spring we just read about in Wes. This causes a great storm, which brings forth the knight Esclaros le Roi to defend his land. This was written by Chrétien de Troyes in the latter part of the 12th century, just after Oise. I just happen to have a 1960 edition of Le Chevalier au Lion, or Yvain. It's quite a story, and it begins where all Arthurian legends do, at the court in Camelot. Artus Liban, roi de Bretagne, la qui presque nos enseigne, que nos soins preux et courtois, d'un corps si riche comme roi, à celle veste qui t'encoste, qu'en droit clamer la Pentecôte. Les rois furent accajoués en Galles, après manger, parmi ces salles, six chevaliers s'attropelleront, là où dames les appelleront. Ou demoiselles ou pucelles, lit un racontoir nouvelle, les autres parleront d'amour, des angoisses et des douleurs. Would you like to keep this book to read about Yvain and the magical fountain at Brocéliande? There you go. Shall I read you some of the story of Yvain? Arthur, the good king of Britain, whose valour teaches us to be brave and courteous, held a court of truly royal splendour at that most costly feast known as Pentecost. The king was at Carlisle in Wales. After dining, the knights gathered in the halls at the invitation of ladies, damsels, or maidens. Some told of past adventures, others spoke of love, of the anguish and sorrows, but also of the great blessings often enjoyed by the disciples of its order, which in those days was sweet and flourishing. But today very few serve love. Nearly everyone has abandoned it, and love is greatly abased, because those who loved in bygone days were known to be courtly and valiant, and generous and honourable. Now love is reduced to empty pleasantries, since those who know nothing about it claim that they love, but they lie, and those who boast of loving and have no right to do so make a lie and a mockery of it. But let us look beyond those who are present among us, and speak now of those who were, for to my mind a courteous man, though dead, is more worthy than a living knave. Therefore it is my pleasure to tell something worthy to be heard about the king, whose fame was such that men still speak of him both near and far. And I agree wholly with the Britons that this fame will last forever. and through him we can recall those good chosen knights who strove for honour. On that Pentecost of which I am speaking, the knights were very surprised to see the king arise early from the table. But that day it happened that the queen detained him, and he tarried so long at her side that he forgot himself and fell asleep. At the entrance to his chamber were Dodinel and Sagramore and Kay and my lord Gawain, and my lord Yvain were there too, and with them was Calogrenant, a very handsome knight, who began telling them a tale, not of his honour, but of his disgrace. Calogrenant said, "Lend me your hearts and ears, for words that are not understood by the heart are lost completely. There are those who hear something without understanding it, yet praise it. They have only the faculty of hearing, since the heart does not comprehend it. The word comes to the ears like whistling wind, but doesn't stop or linger there. Instead, it quickly leaves if the heart is not alert enough to be ready to grasp it. However, if the heart can take and enclose and retain the word when it hears it, then the ears are the path and the channel through which the voice reaches the heart. And the voice, which enters through the ears, is received within the breast by the heart. So he who would hear me now must surrender heart and ears to me, for I do not wish to speak of a dream or a fable or a lie, which many others have served you. Instead, I shall tell what I have seen myself. It happened more than 7 years ago that I, alone like a peasant, was riding along in search of adventures, fully armed as a knight should be. I discovered a path to the right, leading through a thick forest. The way was very treacherous, full of thorns and briars. With considerable effort and difficulty, I kept to this course and this path. For nearly the whole day I rode along in this manner until I emerged from the forest, which was named Brocéliande. From the forest I entered into open country, where I saw a wooden brattice, half a Welsh league away. If it was that far, it was no further. I rode that way at a good pace, saw the brattice and a deep and wide moat all around, and on the drawbridge stood the man to whom the fortress belonged, with a molted goshawk upon his wrist. I had no sooner greeted him than he came to take hold of my stirrup and invited me to dismount. I had no inclination other than to do so, for I needed lodging, and he told me at once, more than 7 times in a row, that blessed was the route by which I had arrived therein. With that, we crossed the bridge and passed through the gate into the courtyard. In the middle of the Vavasour's courtyard, may God grant him as much joy and honour as he showed me that night, the Vavasour struck 3 blows upon this gong with a hammer that was hanging from a little post. Those inside, hearing the voices and this sound, came out of the house and down the courtyard. Some ran to my horse, which the good Vavasour was holding, and I saw that a fair and noble maiden was approaching me. I looked at her intently, for she was beautiful, tall, and proper. She was skilful in helping me disarm, which she did quickly and well. Then she dressed me in a short fur-lined mantle of peacock blue and scarlet. Then everyone left, and no one remained there, with me or with her. This pleased me, for I had eyes for no one else, and she led me to sit down in the most beautiful meadow in the world, enclosed round about with a small wall. There I found her to be so talented, so charming in speech, so gifted, so comforting, and of such a fine nature that I was very delighted to be there, and no duty could ever have caused me to leave. But that night the Vavasseur laid siege to me by coming to fetch me when it was the time and the hour to sup. Since I could tarry no longer, I did his bidding at once. Of the supper, I'll tell you in short that it was entirely to my liking, since the maiden, who was in attendance, was seated opposite me. After dinner, the Vavasseur told me that he couldn't recall how long it had been since he had given lodging to a knight-errant, riding in search of adventure. He had not lodged any in a long while. Then he besought me to accord him the service and recompense of returning by way of his lodging. I responded, "Willingly, sir," for it would have been a shame to refuse him. I would have seemed ungrateful had I refused my host this boon. That night I was lodged well, and my horse was saddled as soon as one could see the dawn. I had ardently requested it the evening before, and my request had been honoured. I commended my good host and his dear daughter to the Holy Spirit, and begged leave of everyone, and set off as soon as I could. It was not far from my lodging when I discovered in a clearing wild bulls on the loose, that were fighting among themselves and making such an uproar and commotion and disturbance that, if the truth be told you, I backed off a little way, for no beast is as fierce or more bellicose than a bull. A peasant who resembled a Moor, ugly and hideous in the extreme, such an ugly creature that he cannot be described in words, was seated on a stump, with a great club in his hand. I approached the peasant and saw that his head was larger than a nag's or other beast's. His hair was unkempt, and his bare forehead was more than 2 spans wide. His ears were as hairy and as huge as an elephant's, his eyebrows heavy, and his face flat. He had the eyes of an owl, and the nose of a cat, jowls split like a wolf's within the sharp reddish teeth of a boar. He had a russet beard, tangled moustache, and a chin down to his breast, and a long twisted spine with a hump. He was leaning on his club, and wore a most unusual cloak, made neither of wool nor linen. Instead, at his neck he had attached 2 pelts freshly skinned from 2 bulls or 2 oxen. The peasant leapt to his feet as soon as he saw me approaching him. I didn't know if he wanted to strike me or what he intended to do, but I made ready to defend myself until I saw that he stood there perfectly still without moving. He had climbed up on a tree trunk, where he towered a good 17 feet high. He looked down at me without saying a word, no more than a beast would have, and I thought he didn't know how to talk and was mute. Nonetheless, I summoned enough nerve to say to him, "Come now, tell me if you are a good creature or not." And he answered, "I am a man." "What sort of man are you?" I asked. "Just as you see, and I'm never anything else." "What are you doing here?" "I stand here and watch over the beasts of the woods." "Watch over them?" "By St. Peter in Rome, they've never been tamed. I don't believe anyone can watch over wild beasts on the plain or in the woods, nor anywhere else, in any way, unless they are tied up and fenced in. I watch over these and herd them so they'll never leave this clearing." "How do you do it? Tell me truly." there's not a one of them that dares move when it sees me coming. For whenever I catch hold of one, I grab it by its two horns with my tough and strong hands, so that the others tremble in fear and gather around me as if crying out for mercy. No one except me could have confidence among them, for he would be killed at once. Thus I am lord over my beasts. Now it's your turn to tell me what sort of man are you, and what you're seeking. I am, as you see, a knight seeking what I cannot find. I've sought long, and yet find nothing. And what do you wish to find? Adventure, to test my courage and strength. Now I pray and beseech you to advise me, if you know, of any adventure or marvellous thing. In this, he replied, you will surely fail. I know nothing of adventure, nor have I heard any talk of it. But should you wish to go to a spring near here, you will not return untested if you abide by the custom of the place. Nearby you will soon find a path that will take you there. Follow the path straight ahead if you don't wish to waste your steps, for you could easily stray. There are many other paths. You will see the spring that boils and yet is colder than marble. It is shaded by the most beautiful tree that nature ever formed. Its leaves stay on in all seasons. It doesn't lose them in even the harshest winter. Also, there is an iron basin hanging on a chain that is just long enough to reach the spring. Beside the spring, you'll see a stone. I can't tell you what kind it is, as I've never seen any like it. And on the other side is a chapel, small but very beautiful. If you will take some of the water in the basin and cast it upon the stone, then you'll see such a storm come up that no beast will remain in this wood. Stags, does, deer, boar, and even birds will fly before it. There will be so much lightning that if you escape without great trouble and distress, you will be more fortunate than any knight who ever went there. I left the peasant as soon as he had shown me the way. It was probably after the hour of tierce, and might even have been near midday when I saw the tree and the spring. I know for a fact that the tree was the most beautiful pine that ever grew upon the earth. I don't believe it could ever rain so hard that a single drop could penetrate it. From the tree I saw the basin hanging, made of the purest gold that ever was sold at any fair. As for the spring, you can be assured that it was boiling like hot water. The stone was of emerald hollowed out like a cask, and it sat upon 4 rubies, brighter and redder than the morning sun when it first appears in the east. Everything I say is the truth, so far as I know it. I was eager to see the miracle of the storm and tempest, but this was unwise on my part, and had I been able, I would immediately have retracted my action, after sprinkling the hollow stone with the water from the basin. But I poured too much, I fear, because I then saw the heavens so rent apart that lightning blinded my eyes from more than 14 directions, and all the clouds pemmel-dropped rain, snow, and hail. The storm was so terrible and severe that 100 times I feared I'd be killed by the lightning that struck about me, or by the trees that were split apart. You can be sure that I was very frightened until the storm died down. But God brought me swift comfort, for the storm did not last long, and all the winds diminished. They dared not blow against God's will, and when I saw clear, pure air, I was filled again with joy. For joy, as I've come to learn, causes great troubles to be soon forgotten. As soon as the storm abated, I saw gathered upon the pine tree so many birds, believe it if you will, that not a leaf or branch could be found that was not completely covered with birds. The tree was more beautiful because of them, and they were singing softly, in perfect harmony. Yet each sang a different song, so that I never heard one sing what another was singing. I rejoiced in their joyousness, and I listened until they had completely finished their service. I had never heard such perfect joy, nor do I believe anyone would hear its equal unless he too goes there, to hear what pleased and delighted me so much that I was totally enraptured. I stayed there so long that I heard what sounded like a knight coming. Indeed, I thought there might be 10 of them, such a racket and clatter was made by a single knight who was approaching. When I saw him coming, all alone, I caught my horse at once, and did not delay in mounting. And he, as if with evil intent, flew at me swifter than an eagle, looking as fierce as a lion. In his loudest voice he began to challenge me, saying, "Vassal, you have greatly shamed and injured me by not offering a proper challenge. If you had just cause, you ought first to have challenged me, or at least claimed your rights, before bringing war against me. So now, if I can, Sir Vassal, I'll make you suffer punishment for the manifest damage you've done. The evidence is all around me, in my woods that have been felled. He who is injured has the right to lodge a complaint, and I do claim, and rightly so, that you have driven me from my house with lightning and rain. You have wronged me, and cursed be he who justifies it. For against my words and my castle you have levelled such an attack that great towers and high walls would have been to no avail for me. No man would have been safe in any fortress whatsoever, whether of timber or solid stone. But rest assured that from now on you'll have no truce or peace from me." At these words we clashed together. We held our shields on our arms, each covering himself with his own. The knight had a good horse, and a stiff lance, and was certainly a full head taller than I. Therefore I was in real trouble, because I was smaller than he, and his horse was better than mine. I am telling you the truth, you must understand, to explain the cause of my shame. I dealt him the mightiest blow that I could, sparing him nothing, and struck the edge of his shield. All my strength was behind my blow, and my lance shattered to pieces. But his remained unbroken, since it was not light at all, but weighed more, I think, than the lance of any other knight. I'd never seen a thicker one, and the knight struck me such a blow that it knocked me over my horse's crupper and flat upon the ground. He left me shamed and defeated there, without glancing even once at me. Leaving me behind, he took my horse and started back along the path, and I, not knowing what to do, remained there, bewildered and dejected. I sat for a while beside the spring and waited. I didn't dare follow the knight for fear of doing something rash, and even had I dared to follow him, I didn't know what had become of him. Finally, I decided that I would keep my word to my host and return to him. This decision pleased me, so that's what I did. But first I removed all my armor in order to proceed more easily, and I returned in shame. When I reached his lodgings that night, I found my host quite unchanged, just as happy and as courteous as I had found him earlier. I did not in the least sense that either his daughter or he was any less happy to see me, or paid me any less honor than they had the night before. In their goodness, everyone in that house showed me great honor, and they said that never before had anyone escaped from where I had come. as far as they knew or had heard tell, but that everyone had been killed or captured. And so I went, and thus I returned. Upon returning, I considered myself a fool. Now, like a fool, I've told you what previously I've never wanted to tell. By my head, said my Lord Yvain, you are my first cousin, and we should love one another dearly. But I'd have to say you were a fool for having hidden this from me for so long. If I've called you a fool, I beg you not to be offended by this, for I'll go forth and avenge your shame if I can. It's clear that it's after dinner, said Kay, who could not restrain his tongue. And so the knights and the queen discuss a trip to this castle. Arthur comes in, of course, and is much intrigued as Guinevere recounts the story to him. And they all mount up and ride to find this mysterious castle at the edge of the forest of Brocéliande and the magical fountain within. And many more adventures happen. I also have some more material for you that might help you on your trip. This one is the Michelin Guide to Brittany, or as we've seen in the Anglo-Norman and Old French, Britannia, not to be confused with Grande Bretagne or Great Britain. There are lots of maps here, and of course notes and little pieces from previous users of this guide. I'll set that aside for you as well. And historically, you've got the Chrétien, the Roman de Rue, the map of Brittany that we'll pulled up, some images from the Bayeux Tapestry, and I thought I'd include this one as well. This book is called The Creation of Brittany, a Late Medieval State. And it is a collection of scholarly articles about Brittany and its birth as a duchy under Anne de Bretagne. Would you like to read that one as well? All right. While I pack these up for you, I can tell you about the legacy of Brocéliande. Wass, who seems himself to have been caught up in the legends and myths surrounding this magical forest, influenced so many people throughout the ages to write stories and visit this place. In various works, from the 13th century Vulgate Histoire de Merlin to Tennyson's Merlin and Vivien idyll. In 1859, Brocéliande is a forest in which Vivien entraps Merlin. So we have a meeting of sorcerers and wizards, and trickery and a magic. And even in 1917, Edwin Arlington Robinson wrote Merlin, about Merlin living for a time with Vivien in Brocéliande, describing it as an Elysian wilderness. So with all of this material, maps, history, legends, you can explore this deep forest, home to Merlin the Wizard's secrets. So I shall fold these maps and put them all together with yours, and we've got the history and maps and Romain de Roux. And then we've got Chrétien and your Michelin guide. Some boats and a lighthouse in Britannia. I'll hand you this bag. It's got handles so you can carry it. And now you have everything you need, my friend, to take a trip into the magical forest of Brocéliande. And as you go deeper, deeper into the cool, mystical forest, with its cool springs and huge trees that have seen the years and ages come and go, you will float off in your imagination to a land of magic and calm and peace. I've got a book here today to show you, but it's not actually important, the book itself, but what's inside of it. Les Romans de Chrétien de Troyes. This is the third volume of some works by Chrétien, romances in the old French language. And today we're going to read about Lancelot, the Chevalier de la Charrette. Do you know what a charrette is? Well, here's a clue. It is shortened in modern language to char, and is used to mean a vehicle, mode of transportation, a vehicular mode. It's a chariot or a wagon, or in this case it's often translated to the knight of the cart. And this edition gives us some introduction, and here we have each section of the text So we get a bit of the plot summary, as it were, or text summary, according to each section. Let's begin by talking a little bit about Chrétien himself. Chrétien de Troyes was an author, and he wrote 5 Arthurian verse romances, among other works. He was a native of the Champagne region, and the only dates we have are that he possibly died between 1185 and 1190. He is indeed the author of our Lancelot ou le Chevalier de la Charrette, which he composed at the request of Marie de Champagne. Marie was the daughter of Louis VII of France and Eleanor d'Aquitaine, who, upon her divorce, married the English King Henry II. Eleanor was herself an avid fan of poetry, and during her time in England commissioned the histories which gave way to many Arthurian romances to be written in the vernacular. Marie, her daughter, from her first marriage, became Marie Champagne, who was Chrétien's patroness. The 12th century witnessed a flowering of literature in the vernacular in France as elsewhere in Europe. In France, there was a move from epic texts, which were decasyllabic assonant laces, or strophes, to the octosyllabic couplet of the Romance, a move from the Matière de France, or the Charlemagne and epics, to the Matière de Bretagne, or the Arthurian romances with fantastical elements. This late 12th century poem in Old French is one of the first stories of the Arthurian legend to feature Lancelot as a prominent character. It features the abduction of Queen Guinevere, and is the first text also to feature the love affair between Lancelot and Guinevere. This story established Lancelot's subsequent prominence in the English Arthurian canon, the Matière de Bretagne. Chrétien was the first writer to deal with these Arthurian themes of Lancelot's lineage, his love affair with Guinevere, including secret love, infidelity, and the overarching theme of courtly love, purportedly one of Marie de France's favourite subjects. The story talks about Guinevere having been abducted by Prince Maleagant. Maleagant tricks Arthur into letting him abduct the queen, despite Gawain's protests. Then, when Gawain finally secures permission from Arthur to pursue them and rescue Guinevere, he meets Lancelot. Lancelot has ridden his horse to death and he's on foot, and Gawain helps him by giving him his own horse. Later Gawain meets him again, and Lancelot has ridden this horse into the ground as well, again on foot. They agree to go together to rescue Guinevere, but Lancelot, having no horse, is forced to take up the offer of a dwarf who is driving a cart and ride in it. This, of course, is very demeaning for a knight, and is the beginning of all of the pains and trials he suffers on his way to rescue Queen Guinevere. He and Gawain separate and reunite from time to time, and there's a multitude of adventures as you would expect in any knightly tale. In the end, of course, there's a big duel with Malegon, and Guinevere is saved. As you can see, here are, in the introduction, is a discussion about what Chrétien's exemplar might have been. So, the literature he was reading, the Arthurian material, the matter of Britain. We're going to look at a passage from Lancelot here, and you can see that the line numbers of different manuscripts are given, as well as the folia numbers there. And this is a quick little passage about when Lancelot is reunited with Guinevere. So we are talking about Le Roi, the King Badon, or the father of Prince Malegon. Quand Lancelot le Chrétien de la préfère et adressait au plus quiconque pouvait se peine, tant qu'il avait leur lendemain, le roi, la reine voir, l'or ne laissa mieux choix. La reine s'ésaille vers terre, un l'alliement requiert. Si l'endroit de son poire et ses filets l'y asseoir, puis parleront à leur plaisir, de quand que leur vin à plaisir, ne matière ne leur failloir, qu'à mort assez leur empailloir. Let's see what this looks like in a manuscript from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. This is the Codex 794 from the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. It's not the actual codex. These are some printouts that I've made. This one to show you how beautifully done those volumes taken in by the Bibliothèque Nationale. We've got a stamp there, an official stamp, and this beautifully clear, precise handwriting telling you the foliant numbers for each work in this manuscript. So when these were collated and bound in centuries. They had front and back end pages put in, and here where someone has written the table of contents with some notes there. Very, very meticulous and clear and well done. And here we see another page from the manuscript with some more notes from the Middle Ages and those that are from the same hand that did the table of contents, as well as librarian. And we have our Bibliothèque Royale stamp that predates the Republic. This manuscript is the Bibliothèque Nationale Française 794. It had different shelf marks throughout history, including Regius 7191.2 and Congé 73. This manuscript is mid-13th century and one of only 2 manuscripts that contain the 5 romances of Chrétien. The other also being in the collection of the Bibliothèque Nationale. This one was transcribed by a certain Guillaume de Provence. We know this because he writes his name, identifying himself, on Folia 105 recto. This is a seminal manuscript for the Old French language, and it also contains, in addition to Chrétien's works, the Roman de Troyes, or the Romance of Troy, and the Roman de Breu, 2 other seminal French romances. So I've brought also a page from the manuscript itself. This is Folia, and you can see the same hand here as the person who wrote the table of contents. This is 44 recto, facing 44 Folia, facing page. And our text begins here, so you can see what that looks like in Old French and as it's written. And we have Quand Lancelot, le coursier de la Perfière et adressier. And you can see how the first letter of each line has been inked apart from the line, and these are to aid the scribe who was copying this. Let's have a look at the language. For doing that, I think we'll write it out in French so that we can mark it up. We'll use this incredibly soft, smooth paper from our favorite notepad. Some Jacques Urbain ink is my favorite at the moment. Amethyst Dural with a wax lid. Makes a nice soft sound. And a nice heavy glass well. You can see a little bit of that amethyst color there. And we'll use a wooden pen with a nib of steel. So you can see that one there. Nice long one with a fiddle shaped separation there. Yeah. There. Now this Bibliothèque Nationale exemplar we're using is one of 6 surviving manuscripts we have of Lancelot, Chrétien's Lancelot, Chevalier de la Charrette, and it's version C, or manuscript C. It's widely known to be the best manuscript of those surviving. Number 794, Bibliothèque Nationale. And the scribe's name was Guillaume, who has a very clear, very regular hand. I don't think that I will be able to replicate that, but we'll write out our passage and I'll do the best I can. Put that there.
when Lancelot hears the king's wrath, he puts forth every effort to make peace and to adjust matters. When his efforts have met with success, the king takes him away to see the queen. This time the queen did not lower her eyes to the ground, but she went to meet him cheerfully, honoring him all she could, and had him sit beside her. Then they talked at great leisure about whatever they felt like, and they were not short of subjects with which love supplied them in abundance. So somewhat less neat than our scribe Guillaume or Guillaume. What can we see here? To take a new ink. This is Diablo Mount. And we'll make some marks on our text. The first thing we notice here is the rhyme, the French Romance style of octosyllabic couplets. Quand Lancelot, le Chrétien, de la paix faire et adressier. So we have our couplets there. Chrétien, adressier, peine, mène, and voir, choir, terre, requert, boire, asseoir, lésir, plaisir, faillot, baillot. The language here is a language of Troyes in southern Champagne, or southern Champenois. Champagne was the crossroads of Western Europe, of commerce, cultural and political exchange, and would be later even the crossroads of the 100 Years' War, being right between the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation and France. The language of Champagne region then shows corresponding variants. One thing we can see in the text we have, and indeed throughout the Lancelot manuscript and Chrétien's works, is a lack of diphthongation. We can see that with the amour. So instead of amour, it's a very light colour. I might reconsider the Diablo Mount. Amour. Without OU diphthong, we have just the O, amour. We also have this other weird diphthong here, the loisir and plaisir. And the OI doesn't appear so much for loisir, and here our diphthong would be plaisir, plaire, se plaire. Another interesting thing we have here is the negation. This shows the crossroads aspect of Champagne, the linguistic crossroads of the Champenois. So we have me, and there's the n, of course, from the Latin directly, and I think that's our only ones here. The me comes from mica, which meant crumb, or a very small piece, rather negligible, and this was a localization favored in the north and east of French-speaking regions, whereas the pa, which we don't see here, but it does occur in these romances by Chrétien, is favored in the central and western regions, and it comes from passum, a step. So our Latin there. So these little localizations are almost like slang. So me is a negation. We also have this use of si. It's been simplified in modern French to mean if, but here in our Old French it was used in different ways to structure or articulate the discourse happening in the verses in the story. For example, it could be used at the beginning of clauses, just like the normal if, but in this case to link them in a temporal sense, such as then or next, just like in the Latin. And here we have si l'honneur descend point et sa fille le lit à soir. So we have a consecutive meaning, the equivalent of modern French a in this instance. The last thing I'd like to show you in this piece of text that we can see is one that has become typical of Old French manuscripts and favoured by Chrétien, the use of an infinitive as a noun. Here we get boire, boire, and ans. And that one comes directly from the Latin antius, a word meaning but or on the contrary. Antius, on the contrary, however, but. So what we happen is after this clause we get an infinitive functioning as a noun, and after a negative clause as well. And this construction gradually fell out of use by the 17th century because the grammarians didn't like it. Today we're going to look at a book about Tintagel Castle on the rugged, beautiful coast of Cornwall.
So make yourself comfortable and let's look at this book together. You can see the castle ruins on the ridge of this piece of land that juts out off the Cornish coast, and the caves in the cliffside. This is a red seal. You can see the king sitting there. And this is a map of the historic site, which now belongs to English heritage. The castle ruins are here and here. The land has fallen down and eroded so that a bridge had to be built between the old town abbey that's still in ruins and the feasting hall, and all around this little promontory are ruins of the outbuildings that serviced this castle. And here we have again the seal, Semper Augustus, and that will be Ricardus, it's Richard. And there we have a beautiful photograph of the sunset setting west of the coast of Cornwall into the sea, built half on the mainland and half on a jagged headland projecting into the Cornish Sea. Tintagel Castle is one of the most spectacular historic sites in Britain. Its association with King Arthur makes it also one of the most famous, but the history of the site stretches back centuries before the first tales of Arthur. During the so-called Dark Ages, roughly the 5th to the 7th centuries, Tintagel was an important stronghold. Large quantities of pottery fragments, remains of luxury goods imported from the Mediterranean, were left behind by those who lived here in its highly defensible position. It is likely to have been a residence of a Dark Age ruler of Cornwall. Tintagel emerges again in the 12th century, but as legend, not history, as a seat of Cornish kings in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, written around 1138, and in continental poems telling the story of Tristan and Isolde. The remains that are visible today belong to a castle built 100 years later on the orders of the hugely rich and ambitious Richard, Earl of Cornwall, who lived from 1209 to 1272. The site was of no strategic value, legend alone seems to have inspired Richard to build in this place. Although the castle had fallen into disrepair by the 1330s, its mythical associations meant that it remained a source of interest. Tourists were arriving by the end of the 17th century, and during the 19th century, the explosion of interest in Arthurian legend and the expansion of the railway brought vast numbers to the site. In the 1930s, the archaeologist Raleigh Radford uncovered remains on the island of what he thought was an early Christian monastery. Archaeological discoveries since have suggested otherwise, but in many ways Tintagel's early history remains mysterious. Together with its spectacular landscape, its mystery has helped to foster the site's special significance as a place of legend long associated with King Arthur. And here we see an aerial view. You can see the foundations of ruins there, the bridges and pathways. And a very nice little drawing of what it might have looked like, this doorway to the castle. And here we have Richard, the Duke of Cornwall, and all of the people coming to greet him, and someone taking his horse, the standard above the portico. So I'm thinking it's his cousin Richard Lionheart, perhaps. Whom he's trying to emulate. And we have a view here. The mainland courtyards. And that's Tintagel Parish Church and the ruins here. Another aerial view, the mainland and the footbridge and the castle remains. And the different stages. These caves might be smugglers' caves, but in legend they're known as Merlin's Cave. We'll read more about that. Here we have what the site will have been around 1260. The port gateways and the mead hall or great hall. By 1337, erosion has led to this wall falling down, as well as bits here. In 1390, even more has fallen into the sea. And in 1540, we don't have much of a change. During the 5th and 6th centuries, an isthmus would have enabled passage directly from the far northwestern end of the lower courtyard to the island. This isthmus survived into the 12th century, as recorded by the scholar Geoffrey of Monmouth in his History of the Kings of Britain, who writes that the only entrance to the island's stronghold in the sea and shut in on all sides by it was by a narrow rock that 3 armed soldiers would be able to defend, even if you had the whole kingdom of Britain at your side. The narrow approach to the island possibly gave the stronghold its name from the Cornish din or tin, meaning a fortress or natural stronghold resembling a fortress, and Tintagel, meaning a constriction, Tintagel, the fortress of the narrow entrance. By the 1230s, when Richard built his castle, the isthmus had already partly eroded on the side of the cliff. Beside the steps, rubbish deposits dating from before the building of the castle have been exposed by later landfalls. Here we see the courtyard on the island. So coming from the mainland, and there are the buildings, and then either side of the entrance, the courtyard. And there we see what was built after 1852. So the orange parts are the oldest, and the 14th century saw the green. Richard would have built all of the orange and yellow parts. And here's a beautiful, beautiful old map. John Norden's depiction of Tintagel, about 1604, showing the treacherous passage to the island and sheep grazing among the castle buildings. See the little sheep, and having to climb down and up to get up to that castle. Must have been a very quiet and lonely place. And truly, like Brittany, its coastline is replete with mystery. This is the Iron Gate. There's a cave and a gate there. On leaving the Great Hall path, immediately to the right leads down towards a cleft in the rocks. Sometimes it erodes up under, and there are holes where the sea can be heard. This forms a small cove that faces northeast and is sheltered from the prevailing westerly winds. The path stops the cove at an archway in a curtain wall, which was once closed off by a gate. From here, defenders could prevent access to the land via the cove and the larger haven to the south. John Leyland, visiting the site in 1540, writes that men all saw therein a postern door of iron, hence the Iron Gate. There is now no access to the cove beyond the curtain wall, which runs from the edge of the cliff overlooking the cove to a point about 30 meters to the southwest, where the slope becomes precipitous. And truly, if you are not careful, invasion from Spain before the Armada of 1588, the naval commander Sir Richard Grenville, 1542 to 1591, recorded the use of the Iron Gate as a landing place, noting that 4 or 5 ships could, with most winds, ride and lay their sides to the works and land any company of men. Here are some older remains. This is a glass fragment found in the lower mainland courtyard that came from a bowl decorated with an inscription. Looks to be in Latin with some birds. And here we have the island remains looking south towards the island courtyard. And these ruins here on either side. There's the courtyard there. These ones are from hundreds, 1,000 years earlier than the rest of the castle. There we can see this is what the island would have looked like about 700. And that's these stone remains there. So it looks to have been always part of a stone fortress and a nice little cove for ships. The Arthurian slate found on the eastern slopes of Tintagel Island had been trimmed to fit over a 5th to 7th century drain near the main buildings. Discovered in 1998, it had 2 surviving sets of partial inscriptions. The first consists of 4 large letters and dates from before the second text. The second includes lightly inscribed letters that denote male personal names and is thought to date from the 6th century. All the lettering is in the nature of casual graffiti. And they look to be Celtic names. The interesting thing about this is that it mentions Arthurnu. The name Arthurnu is Celtic and can be translated as bear, famous, or famous in a bear-like way. Paterni Goliawi ficit Arthurnu Goliawi. The image of the bear was used in early poetry to represent heroic valor. Art, later Arth, was a common element in personal names. The similarity to Arthur is, however, only partial, and was shared by many other names. Goliawi and Paterni are forms of name denoting relationship, but with only a fragment remaining, the type of relationship remains unclear. Ficit, of course, being Latin for maid, third person singular. Here we have this mysterious tunnel. The origins of the tunnel are unknown. It may be an extension of a natural fissure, enlarged by chiseling the rock. There are marks made by narrow chisel that can be seen on the walls. One idea is that it served as a long and narrow larder for the castle in the Middle Ages, and may have had a door set in a wooden frame at the end near the sea to aid cooling and food preservation. This is a kiln in the corner of one of the houses of the northern ruins. It was probably used for drying corn in the Middle Ages, when the Dark Ages buildings may have constituted a farmstead. Courtenay Arthur Raleigh Radford was born in 1900. After graduating from Oxford, he helped excavate Whitby Abbey. Under Charles Pearce, the chief inspector of ancient monuments, he then spent several years studying and traveling abroad, and in 1933 began excavations at Tintagel at the request of the Ministry of Works. And in 1935, the first edition of his guide to the site was published. It's another beautiful view of this cove of mystery. And here, a granite stone found in the remains of the island chapel and thought to date from the 12th or 13th century. It is now built into the side altar of the north transept of Tintagel Parish Church. And there are the remains of the chapel of St. Juliot, with the Camelot Castle Hotel on the mainland, visible in the distance. In descending to the haven at the front of the valley, the remains of the platforms and derricks via which slate was loaded onto the ships waiting in the harbour below can be seen. There they're loading slate onto ships. It's a very romantic view of Tintagel with the rainbow going over it. The haven was long regarded as an excellent place to land. On the west side of the haven beach is the entrance to a cavern that passes right through the neck of the island. It shows signs of having been widened as a consequence of mining work, but it had also been eroded by the water that runs through it at high tide. Since the late 19th century, it has been named Merlin's Cave. And there we see a depiction here. Merlin stands on the shore of Tintagel as the sea delivers him the future King Arthur. And this is a French edition of The Idylls of the King by Alfred Lord Tennyson, illustrated by Gustave Doré. Merlin's Cave is probably so called because of the popularity of Tennyson's sequence of 12 poems, Idylls of the King, published between 1859 and 1885, in which Merlin plucks the infant Arthur from the sea. When Uther in Tintagel passed away, moaning and wailing for an heir, the two, Merlin and Blay, dropped to the cave and watched the great sea fall, wave after wave, each mightier than the last, till last a ninth one, gathering half the deep and full of voices, slowly rose and plunged roaring, and all the wave was in a flame, and down the wave and in the flame was born a naked babe, stooped and caught the babe and cried, "The king, here is an heir for Uther." And here we have a manuscript of Tristan and Iseult. Here King Mark discovers Tristan and Iseult embracing inside Tintagel Castle, and Tristan then leaves Tintagel in disgrace. And there they are embracing, and the King Mark is there, and there's Tristan. Here we can see that this is a French manuscript, but late. It is a 15th century manuscript. It's a beautiful gold leaf. Look at that. And lines very clearly written. And we have the history from pre-Roman times. The coastline of this part of Cornwall is fretted with picturesque beaches and narrow bays that resound to crashing waves. Heavily defended headland settlements of this type are found in the Iron Age period, roughly 7th century BC to the 1st century AD. Evidence for a Roman presence near Tintagel is slight, and comes late in the Roman occupation of Britain, about AD 43 to 410. A Roman milestone from the 3rd century was found in Tintagel courtyard. There we can see it. Tintagel seems to have been very active in trade, with the Mediterranean being on the Cornish coast. Here we have a purse of Roman coins, or one coin from this Roman purse of coins that was found near the Great Ditch. This one was minted under Emperor Tetricus I, who reigned from 270 to 273. And here we can see I think it's a mosaic of a Roman trade ship loaded with goods. This exists in the Villa Romana del Casale in Sicily and dates to the 3rd century. And there we can see pottery finds at Tintagel and a Roman amphora. This amphora would have carried wine or oil. This kind of pottery, as well as glass, were imported from all over the Mediterranean during the Dark Ages. The known sources of the wares are shown here. North African red slipware, wine jars, just in Turkey's southeast and west coast, and all through the Aegean. Glassware from Gascony, what would become Gascony, and the south of Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, all on the sea route to Tintagel. Several thousand pieces of pottery have been found at Tintagel. Some are local Romano-British, and some are medieval and date from the time of the castle, but most date from the Dark Ages, and nearly all of the latter were imported from the Mediterranean. Here we have these stories of King Arthur. Here's King Arthur battling some cat-like monster known as the Chevalier, depicted on a floor mosaic at Otranto Cathedral in Italy, dating from between 1163 and 1166. And here is one of Arthur fighting on St. Michael's Mount from an early 15th century copy of Geoffrey of Monmouth. The foremost figure, popularly linked with Tintagel, is King Arthur. There is minimal historical evidence for Arthur, and nothing to associate him with Tintagel until the 12th century. The earliest surviving mention of his name is in the Historia Britonum, a manuscript assembled from a mixture of historical sources and folk tales in North Wales, about 829 to 830, attributed in one text to a scholar called Nennius. Arthur was probably included in the Historia Britonum to please Merlin, King of Gwynedd in North Wales. And I don't know if my Welsh pronunciation is correct, so if you are Welsh, please be kind in the comments. I'm sorry if I mispronounce the Welsh. The first of a new dynasty of kings, Merlin may have wanted to associate himself with a war hero believed to have repeatedly defeated the forebears of the English kings who had harassed Wales in the early 9th century. Arthur's enormous international popularity was largely owing to one author, a scholar called Geoffrey of Monmouth. It was he who first linked Arthur with Tintagel, describing it as the island fortress where Arthur was conceived, thanks to the magic of Merlin. In about 1138, Geoffrey drastically embellished previous accounts of Arthur in his Historia Regnum Britanniae. By this time, stories of Arthur and his warriors were already known on the continent. Geoffrey described Arthur as a youth of unparalleled courage and generosity, joined with that sweetness of temper and innate goodness, as granted him universal love and turned him as an adult from a victorious battle leader into the greatest of a line of kings of Britain and conqueror of most of Western and Northern Europe, whose renown had attracted the bravest knights of the continent to his court. Geoffrey also included elements of legend that depicted Arthur defeating a giant on St. Michael's Mount. Despite these more obvious fantasies, Geoffrey placed Arthur in an apparently historical 6th century Britain, expressed in detail relevant to his 12th century audience, and so provided the court of the Norman kings of England with a credible, heroic role model. And this is a round table that was made about 1290, and you can see King the third on it, he was a big fan of King Arthur and Arthurian legend. There were the names of all of the knights. This is the earliest known Arthurian round table, but made in 1290. The painting on the surface of the tabletop is actually 16th century. It now hangs in the Great Hall of Winchester Castle. So from Geoffrey of Monmouth's time, that was the time of Henry II, Arthur, the stories of King Arthur had become a hugely popular phenomenon all over the whole of Europe. And here we have another story related to Tintagel and Arthurian legend. King Mark of Cornwall, the true story of Tristan and Isolde, or in German Tristan und Isolde. Also surviving in many versions, English, French, and German being the most popular. It should be remembered that Tintagel is hardly mentioned in Arthurian romance except in the work of Geoffrey and his followers. An educated European in about 1200 would sooner have associated the name Tintagel with the legendary figures of Mark and Tristan. King Mark of Cornwall first appears as a local king in legends from Wales, Cornwall, and Britannia. In his 9th century life of Saint Paul Aurelian, a Breton monarch identifies Mark with a king, Cunimorus, who ruled in Cornwall in the 6th century. A standing stone near Fowey claims to mark the grave of Tristanus, son of Cunimorus. It has been suggested that Tristanus is Tristan, son of Mark. Raleigh Radford thought that Castle Dorey, a small Iron Age fort near Fowey, had been Cunimorus' fortress, but the fort is now known to have had no significant Dark Age occupation. The connection of the name Tristan with Tintagel arose in the 12th century, when the earliest surviving accounts of the story of Tristan and Isolde, continental poems from France and Germany, were first composed. In these, Tintagel appears as the location of King Mark's court. Tristan is not his son, but his nephew, who becomes the lover of Mark's wife Isolde. Though originally part of a separate story, by the end of the 12th century, Mark, Tristan, and Isolde had been drawn firmly into the ambit of Arthur, Mark as a contemporary minor king, and Tristan as knight of the Round Table. And here we have the story of Richard, Earl, not Duke as I said before, but I do make mistakes, sorry about that. Richard, Earl of Cornwall, and his lion. Look at that. This is a floor tile from an abbey in Somerset, dating from the end of the 13th century, and that's Richard of Cornwall's coat of arms. And this is what his Tintagel castle would have looked like. And here we see everything that belonged to Richard, Earl of Cornwall. The construction of a castle at Tintagel would have done little to dent the wealth richest men in Europe, while many of Richard's surviving charters concern the boroughs of Cornwall, which was one of the major sources of his revenues, profiting as he did from the export of Cornish tin. He rarely visited the country. Arthur and his knights would have been the principal role models for boys in royal and noble households, including Richard. Richard was the second son of King John and younger brother of Henry III, making Richard Lionheart his Uncle Dickie. Richard had huge estates in England and used this wealth to pursue a European throne. But though he was crowned King of the Romans on 17th of May 1257, and that's the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, therefore he was nominally the king of modern-day Germany, or emperor of all of the German kingdoms, but he never managed to translate this title into real power there. He was made Earl of Cornwall by Henry in 1227, making him the most powerful man in the county. Later, Tintagel had become a prison. Despite the castle's increasingly ruinous condition, Mass was still said in the chapel on the island, and a survey of the properties made in 1337 for the Black Prince, the son of Edward III, who became that year the first Duke of Cornwall, described 2 decayed chambers over 2 gateways, one sufficient chamber with a kitchen for the constable, a decayed stable for 8 horses, a cellar, and a ruined bakehouse. And here we have Edward III granting his son, Edward the Black Prince, the Principality of Aquitaine. And here, by 1583, we can see that the castle is falling to ruins. And here is a very handsome portrait of Sir Richard Grenville in 1571, who died of wounds fighting at sea in 1591. Tennyson, who celebrated Arthur in Idylls of the King, also celebrated Grenville in his poem called The Revenge, after his ship. And here we have Life Goes On at Tintagel. Slate and a ship at the cove, possibly smugglers using the caves, and archaeology and the revival of the Gothic, as well as pre-Raphaelite inspiration. A film is made at Tintagel for MGM Studios. Ava Gardner was Guinevere, Mel Ferrer as King Arthur, Robert Taylor as Sir Lancelot. The movie was called Knights of the Round Table. And there we have a bit of geological markings to show the cliffs and crags and the remains of all the buildings at Tintagel, this wonderful Cornish site. relaxed now. I wish you sweet dreams and a very restful, pleasant sleep. Be good to yourself. Be kind to others.